Well, hello, y'all. Thanks for joining the panel on Indica Sativa Hybrid Terpenes. I hope our discussion today will be informative and educational and give you some insight into how to control your cannabis effects. To kick things off, I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Shayda Torabi, and I'm your moderator for this discussion. I'm a proud born and raised Austinite who founded one of Texas's premier cannabis brands, Restart CBD, back in 2018 with my two younger sisters. We're an education first brand and create a lot of content to better help the community understand the power of this plant. In addition to running Restart CBD, I'm also the host of a cannabis and marketing podcast called To Be Blunt, where I talk to industry professionals from Texas to Colorado and California and beyond on how they market and grow their cannabis businesses and brands. So it is a big honor to be here with y'all today for this monumental event reflecting Texas cannabis and beyond. I'm going to invite each of my panelists to share a little bit about themselves and introduce themselves, and then we'll dive into today's topic. So please welcome Anita to the panel.
Hi, thank you so much. Good morning, beautiful souls. I'm actually really humbled and honored to be a part of Lux Summit's Planting the Seed. Thank you so much for having me. I wanted to personally say happy early birthday to the legend himself, Willie Nelson. Hope he enjoys his special day. My name is Anita Sommers, and I am the CBD Genie, Cannabis Science Communicator. Cannabis use is not new, but once the bar was raised with science and analytical diagnostics, as a scientist, I'm like, yes, now you're speaking my language. Literally, because everyone started asking molecular questions. THCA, THC, what are the effects? How does this work? Is this real? So it is my mission and passion to educate the biochemistry of cannabis via the endocannabinoid system, or the ECS, explaining how it works, to be the liaison between Mother Earth and the science behind her elements, compounds, and microbiome. So if you're trying to have an educational cannabis event, whether in person or virtual, it would be my pleasure to stand up for Mother Earth and to educate the facts, leading with science. My passion at your service. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita, for joining us. I'm super excited for you to bring your wealth of knowledge and communication on these complex subjects to our audience today. Now, I'd like to introduce Rachelle to the panel. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. My name is Rachelle Gordon. I am a cannabis writer and journalist. I've been featured in several industry-specific publications, from High Times to Cannabis Now, Cannabis and Tech Today, Highly Capitalized, and several others. I am also the resident cannabis copywriter for Boveda, makers of the original Terpene Shield. Very excited to be here talking about terpenes and explaining how we can save them in order to enhance our experience. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us, Rachelle. I'm really excited. I'm a big fan of Boveda myself, and obviously them being a brand that helps champion terpenes, and especially with your history of, again, writing on these different cannabinoids and the effects for consumers. I think it'll bring a lot of education to our audience. And welcome, Andrew, to the panel.
Hey, everybody. My name is Andrew Marlatt. I'm the general manager at Farm Labs Texas, Texas's premier third-party analytical testing lab for hemp and other ethnogens. I've been in the industry my whole adult life, pretty much. I specialize in extraction, post-processing, formulation. I'm one of the co-inventors of the U-Test kit by CB Scientific, which is a CBD and THC detection kit that works much like a colorimetric pool test, as well as, I have a few hundred SOPs for novel products.
Thank you, Andrew, for joining us. You are someone that in just my, personal circle has been just such a wealth of information helping educate me. And ultimately, that's why I hope we can help connect the dots for the consumers today and for the community and for the audience. And we're talking about terpenes. I'm sure everybody's familiar with indica, sativa, and hybrid, but terpenes is really the meat of what the effects of cannabis really are in terms of how it works within our own bodies and how bioavailable our bodies are when it comes to absorbing cannabis. And so I want to kick off the discussion by asking Anita to help us define what is a terpene, where are they found, and what are the benefits of terpenes?
Yes. So first, I want you to just imagine that you just peeled an orange and you smell that fresh citrus aroma. Or picture this, you're walking through a rich pine forest and you inhale that fresh pine scent. Terpenes are the aromatic compounds, or I like to also call them scent molecules found in nature. And these molecules are extremely volatile, which just means they evaporate easily, and that's why we can smell them. Well, cannabis also has terpenes, and because there are so many varieties or cultivars of cannabis, there are so many different terpene profiles. And depending on the terpene profile, that will determine the aroma of the cannabis flower. If it's going to be fruity, skunky, earthy, spicy, floral. And if you've ever gazed at that frosty crystal-like appearance of the cannabis flower, that look is due to the trichomes. And in Greek, trichoma means hair. So there's these glandular hairs on the surface of the flower. And if you were to zoom in on one of those glandular heads of the trichomes, that's where the terpenes are synthesized, along with the phytocannabinoids as well. And it's important to understand that terpenes in nature, it's not just for the scent. Terpenes actually help the plant. They protect the plant. They produce the resin. They attract pollinators. And the benefits of terpenes for the human body is that these scent molecules also aid the body in homeostasis or balance with the endocannabinoid system.
Thank you for that that description of it. I think, personally speaking, I've been a cannabis consumer for the past 15 years. Especially being in Texas, obviously our market is not quite as broad as some of the other states that have full legalization. And so when it comes to using cannabis products, it's not something that was really discussed about. You didn't really hear a lot of people saying, oh, what terpenes are present in this? It was just, oh, I want to, buy this gram, or I want to try this edible or this tincture. But now with the market opening up, specifically from my perspective on CBD, especially here in Texas, seeing a huge CBD market, you are starting to see the evolution of the consumer really trying to hone in on effects beyond just the psychotropic high that we sometimes enjoy. I personally enjoy the effects of Delta-9, THC, but really beyond just these different cannabinoids, it's the terpenes that are helping activate that effect. And so I just kind of want to populate that out for the audience to really start digging into what are these terpenes. So as we're talking, take notes. Again, everybody's body is going to be responding differently to different cannabinoids, terpene combinations, even the type of products. And so our hope for this panel is just to help make you more canna curious. And so with that, I'm going to turn it to Rachelle to help answer, what are top terpenes found in the cannabis plant and what do we know about their effects?
Yes, so there are actually hundreds of unique terpenes found in nature, but in cannabis, we've kind of realized that there are a number that kind of stand out that are the most prevalent. The first one being myrcene. This is definitely the most prevalent cannabis terpene. It's a very herbal, earthy flavor. It has a more sedative, relaxing effect. Beta-caryophyllene is also a very popular terpene found in cannabis. It's a little more peppery. It's actually found to be an anti-inflammatory. And it's also known as its own cannabinoid because it actually activates the endocannabinoid system, interestingly enough. Pinene is another one that we find quite a bit. It's found in pine trees, hence its name. It's more evergreen, has an anti-anxiety effect. Linalool is another prevalent cannabis terpene, also found in lavender. It has a very floral scent, has a very calming effect. Limonene is another one, very citrusy, delicious, uplifting. That's one of my personal favorites. Humulene, which is also found in hops, has a very dank smell. If you've ever had an IPA beer and it sort of smelled familiar, it's because it's a cousin. It's also found in cannabis. It has another anti-inflammatory effect. The final cannabis terpene I'll talk about is terpinolene. This is actually my favorite. It's technically the least prevalent. It's maybe in about 1 in 10 cannabis strains, but it has a very fresh, herbaceous smell, and it tends to be a little more psychedelic, which I really appreciate. So there are other terpenes found in cannabis, but those are the ones that we wanted to hit on today as they're the most prevalent.
Yeah, and just to kind of reemphasize, you highlighted linalool, which you mentioned is found in lavender, as well as pinene, which is found in pine, just to kind of tie into what Anita was sharing earlier. You know, obviously, when you associate lavender, it is more, I'm going to take a lavender bath, I'm going to relax, I'm getting ready for bed. And so to kind of orient you, these terpenes do have added effects to enhance what you are consuming, whether you're smoking something or eating something or applying something to your skin. And so it's not so much just, do you have 10 milligrams? Is it 50 milligrams? Is it indica or sativa? Those categorizations are really being placed because of these terpenes that are activating within that strain or that specific product. And so again, we always talk about indica sativa hybrid. I'm really curious why that is. So Andrew, why do we always talk about indica sativa and hybrid, and why are they not always accurate ways of describing the feeling or effect that someone might have when they consume that product?
Sure. So indica and sativa really only delineate. It's a Linnaean term. Linnaeus is the guy we all studied about peas in grade school. And they just describe really how the plant grows. Now, it is true that, most sativas have an uplifting effect and most indicas have a sedative effect. But there is no landrace strains anymore. They're all hybrids. And, there's lists of sativas that have indica-like effects. And there's lists of genetic indicas that have a sativa-like effect. So ultimately, what it comes down to is what we should be describing is how the synergy between cannabinoids and the entourage effect of the terpenes being present affects the individual endocannabinoid system. And so that's kind of a brief overview of it.
I want to also encourage Anita to kind of chime in just from a scientific perspective. Why do our bodies feel a certain way when we are consuming these different terpenes and cannabinoids, and how do they maybe change? For example, maybe a precursing question would be, do terpenes that exist in nature always translate into the end product? I find sometimes they're added in after the fact. Obviously, when it's coming to the flower, they're existing naturally, but when you're getting into edibles or, topicals or sublinguals, those terpenes seem to be added in after. Kind of help us understand what that dynamic is.
Well, honestly, that is a beautiful question, because terpenes, depending on what it is going to offer a different effect. And to understand why you feel a certain way requires unlocking the magic of chemistry. So in nature, depending on what it is, as we've been listing all of these beautiful terpenes, you can add it back to your product. Terpenes are hydrocarbons, meaning that they just have hydrogens and carbons. And these compounds, they have the exact same, some of them, for example, alpha-pinene, limonene, myrcene, they're isomers of each other because they have the exact same molecular formula, except that their structure is different in nature. And what's important to understand is if you have the same molecular formula, then they usually have the same effects in nature. The thing is, structure determines your function. You wouldn't use a hammer to sweep the floor because that structure doesn't match that function. In biochemistry, it's the same way. Depending on the structure of the compound will determine which effects that you're going to have on the body. But what's important to also understand, though, is that everyone's going to respond differently. So it's not, you can't say always in biology or with nature, because the variability is so grand, not only just with the person, the variability of where the terpene is coming from, the variability of how that plant or fruit or whatever it is in nature was grown or cultivated. There's a lot of beautiful variables that come into play. But the one thing that's constant is when you understand the molecular formula, then you can actually have a better understanding of, again, the sense or the potential of it helping, aiding other phytocannabinoids via the Entourage Effect, because they can help with permeability. And permeability is a big deal when you're talking about bioavailability. And it can just basically, what that simply means is the rate at which a compound is introduced to the bloodstream. So it's a beautiful thing to be able to just mix and match nature. I'm still learning about all of that stuff. So I just want to just flat out say, as long as you know the molecular structures, that's a really good start.
Yeah, I think it's really important to continue to emphasize with the audience too. There's such a wide array of products on the market today. And the best thing that you can do to find the product that's going to ultimately work for you is to, one, do the research on who you're sourcing your products from. Unfortunately, not all products are created equal, both in the legal market as well as the unregulated but legal hemp market, as well as obviously the black market. But these products exist, and they always, kind of try to point you or guarantee you towards a certain effect. This is going to be really good for sleep. This is going to be really good for uplifting. This is going to make you feel creative and euphoric. And it's kind of an interesting challenge when you look at that product and you consume it personally. Like, I remember going to Colorado with a friend, and we had the same strain, and he smoked it and I smoked it, and I felt way more sedated than he did. And he was like, come on, like, let's go. We want to go hike. And I was like, no, I'm very sleepy right now. And so again, just kind of highlight, just because something says it's a particular indica or sativa, trying to kind of back out of it and remind yourself that it's ultimately your body that's consuming it. So there are a few different levers. It's like, what is the product you're consuming? Is it a smokable versus an edible? You mentioned the word bioavailability. Smokables are going to hit you much faster. You're going to feel the effects faster, but it might fade faster, versus an edible, which is going to take longer to take effect, but might last longer. Those are going to hit you different. Then the next category, in my opinion, is milligrams. Is it 10 milligrams smoking versus 10 milligrams eating? 50 milligrams, 50 milligrams? Then you're getting into what is the actual makeup of that science of the plant. Is it high in caryophyllene? Is it high in myrcene? What is the genetic strain? And again, it's something just I think that all of us can agree and reflect on observing in the market. There's not always consistency in these conversations, which is why it's so exciting to be able to have this conversation with y'all today, because we're just trying to hopefully help you be a little bit more candid, curious to ask these questions and ultimately explore how it impacts within your own body. So I'm going to turn it to Rachelle, and I really want to help our audience understand, what is the importance of educating consumers on terpenes, and how does it interact with their bodies beyond just the cannabinoids? Kind of like the importance of the full spectrum and the entourage effect. And so if you can also help us define, we talk about entourage effect, but what is the entourage effect?
Sure. Well, the entourage effect is the idea that all of the parts of the plant working together in perfect harmony will give us optimal effects. Someone once described terpenes specifically to me in this way, and I think it makes a lot of sense. If cannabinoids, delta 9, delta 8 THC, CBD, CBN, if that's the gasoline that's powering your vehicle, the terpenes are the GPS system guiding where the experience will take you, which I think is a really great analogy. So it's really important that we remember that these compounds work together, and that when they're separate, they will actually potentially have different effects too. So for some products, we have the natural cannabis-derived terpenes that exist in the plant that were discussed earlier, but then sometimes terpenes are added, as we've also discussed, and sometimes those plant-derived terpenes can even have a different effect than a cannabis-derived terpene. So it's really important to educate yourself on the source of the terpenes. If you're at a retail location, talk to the staff and find out, where did this product come from? How was it created? And it will help it will help you make your decision a little bit easier so that you can understand how they will work for you. But again, every person is different. And so to the earlier point, yes, one thing may affect you in a different sort of way than another person. So kind of dialing it in, going slow but slow, and understanding how it will affect you. Make a journal, a terpene journal. That's something I really like to do. I write down how a cannabis product has affected me, what terpenes, what the cannabinoid percentages are, so that I can truly understand what works best for me. And it's something I would really encourage other people to do as well.
I love that you highlighted that. I think everybody should be documenting, especially if you're a new consumer into cannabis. great highlight, just keeping track of what is working for your own body. And then that gives you points to go out when you are maybe going and visiting legal markets, or you are shopping with different dispensaries in your state and beyond, just to know, hey, my body really responded well to these products. Maybe I should gravitate more towards those products. Sorry, Andrew, you were going to add something?
No, I was going to say I keep much the same journal just because I'm my own favorite guinea pig, but I also track the food that I've eaten over the last couple of days, because dietary terpenes greatly affect consumed cannabinoids. So if you've consumed a huge amount of mango that day, there's a tremendous amount of myrcene in there. And so a peppered steak can affect the way the cannabinoids hit you. So it really, really is important to look at the whole, we'll call it an ecosystem. Your endocannabinoid system is an entire ecosystem. And I loved that reference of saying that if the engine is the cannabinoids, the terpenes are the GPS. And, I would add to the discussion of, plant-derived terpenes as opposed to cannabis-derived terpenes. Also, the methodology of the extraction of those terpenes greatly changes the way that the terpenes affect you. And so, terpenes are terpenes. I wouldn't say that they're bad coming from, other plants, but there's so much information to take in. So,
Anita, did you want to add something to that too?
I mean, he was nailing it. The whole person concept is key here, not to just put all your eggs in one basket, and also understanding that how we all respond differently. Living in Austin, if you have allergies, that's already a different lifestyle, because that's your body overreacting to nature, right? In that case, an allergen. But it's important to understand that we all respond differently. And I'm just going to say it one more time. It's so amazing that she had mentioned to dialogue, or to keep track of everything that you do. That's a great job. Yeah.
It really goes a long way. And Andrew, you highlighted it. You're your own guinea pig. And I think especially in cannabis, and I'm sure the panelists would also agree with this, and maybe the audience isn't, very familiar with this, but there is so much unregulation, despite even the legality of marijuana in legal states like California and Colorado and Washington State, and even hemp's legality federally. So many things are unregulated. And so I know on one end, specifically speaking from the retail side, it's much more difficult to get cannabis terpenes, especially when you're adding it back into products like sublingual oils or edibles and things like that. It's not impossible. It's just, I observe that that's not always as accessible as a product on the market versus flower, which is always going to be kind of the organic cannabis terpenes, because it's how the plant is growing essentially. And so that gets into the strain and into the genetics. But a question I have for you, Andrew, is around consuming terpenes, kind of playing devil's advocate. Why terpenes? Like, I guess two-part question. What is cannabis without terpenes? Because I know you and I had a sidebar conversation around, like, just let's say delta-9 THC without any terps or any other cannabinoids, what that effect is, versus I've had customers come into the shop and like, I want to buy terpenes. I want to buy terpenes and put it in my own products. And kind of what I've observed in the market is they're also very volatile, and consumers shouldn't really be handling terpenes. So again, I think everybody's very excited about this conversation, but don't rush to, your local HEB or cannabis shop and try to buy terpenes outright, because that's also not something that I personally see or really encourage people to be playing with. So kind of what's your perspective on that?
So cannabinoids on their own have, you can isolate them down to specific cannabinoids, THCA, THC, delta-8, CBD, so on and so forth. The effect that they have on their own is usually quite muted. When you introduce terpenes, you start to see novel effects. Should consumers be playing with terpenes? No, they're quite often caustic and quite often acidic, and you can really damage yourself. I've more than once got a little drop of terpenes that were purified terpenes on my skin and got a blister from it. And I think people should be aware that in the small quantities, 1 to at most 5% on average that you're going to find terpenes in products, it's completely safe. Straight terpenes, though, let the professionals do that.
Yeah, thank you for touching on that, just because I know it's going to come up. People are going to be really excited, and they're going to want to go pick all the terpenes out and say, this is the terp that I really associate with, and now I want to go put it in everything to get that effect. And it doesn't quite work that way, but kind of shifting to the more natural way to get terpenes, which is in the flower. I am really excited because Rachelle represents Boveda, which if you're kind of in the cannabis space, their whole motto is they save the terps. They're there to preserve the terps. So I wanted you to help kind of explain why that's even a topic. Why do we need to save the terps when it comes to our flower, and just kind of preserving the integrity of the plant in general? It is a very sensitive plant. I mean, when you get the flower, let's say from a farm, and then you dry it out and you kind of trim it and it turns into a consumer product, I'm sure the audience can relate if they've ever had some flower gone dry. Maybe the effects have changed over time. And so that's partially due to the chemistry that is happening with the plant because it is being exposed to this, that, or the other. So Rachelle, kind of help us understand from your perspective where Boveda kind of sits to help preserve that, and what are the benefits of preserving the terps?
Right, exactly. So as we've mentioned earlier, terpenes are very volatile and they actually do evaporate. So when you open that bag or that jar and you get that loud, pungent aroma that hits you, it's actually the terpenes escaping into your container. It's actually not optimal to have that happen, even though it might feel great when you smell that. So essentially what Boveda does is it creates a monolayer of purified water molecules around the plant trichome in order to lock in and preserve the terpenes and cannabinoids. Because when exposed to oxygen, the trichomes and the terpenes degrade, and it actually causes your cannabis to be less effective and less potent, which nobody wants, especially people who are really needing those effects, medical patients, for example. We need to make sure that they're getting all of the active ingredients that they need. And when cannabis is stored, those terpenes evaporate really quickly, up to 40% within a week. And so we really want to make sure that people are getting the full experience, and especially the one that the cultivator worked so hard to create. And so that's why it's so important that our Boveda packets go right in with the flower and create that monolayer in order to really preserve and lock in the flavor, effects, and aroma that we expect.
I appreciate you sharing that, because it is, as the knowledge continues to evolve on cannabis consumption, and especially how cannabis is interacting with our own bodies, it is really important, especially if you've highlighted, maybe you found a particular strain or product that you do enjoy. You want to make sure that you're preserving the integrity of that effect as you are consuming that product versus, you buy a product, and then I know this is another contribution, light, what you store that product in, how hot or cold the environment is. There's obviously now products on the market in addition to Boveda that are there to really help you ensure the integrity of that product. But I know some of the conversations I've had with some of our panelists kind of offline leading up into this conversation is just how sensitive these cannabinoids and terpenes are, really how sensitive cannabis as a plant is. And so I don't say it to make you, afraid of what's going to happen to this plant or what's going to happen when I consume it in my body, but more to excite you and energize you to really figure out how can you figure out what's the right product for you, and then how can you preserve that effect that is ultimately what you're taking it for. And so Rachelle kind of highlighted again too, especially when you're looking at the medical market, people who are looking for a consistent effect, they want to take it for a particular reason. You obviously don't take medication crossing your fingers hoping that it's going to work the same way every day that you're taking it. It's more consistent to that. And so kind of putting the same mentality with the plant, there are ways to help preserve it to make sure that it is as I don't want to say pure, but as possible as it can be for you to be consuming it in that regard. I want to kind of bring it back though to the indica versus sativa. And so I'm going to turn it to Anita. I really want to understand, why do we say those things? Where do people come up with indica versus sativa? From my knowledge, it's really the plants. There's cannabis indica and there's cannabis sativa. Hemp as a plant is actually cannabis sativa, but now it seems like we've twisted and turned these words, and now they're slapped on product labels and put on banners, and content's created around it, and people come into my shop and they say, I want the sativa effect, or I want the indica effect. And I always have to be like, okay, well, I have these terpenes that are more classified in this way, but kind of help us from your perspective understand the actual indica sativa hybrid conversation.
Yeah, so I definitely I've steered away from that term lately, just because I just want to continue to educate the chemistry, right? So indica, when I think indica, I'm immediately just thinking of the short, broad, the leaves, right? And then sativa being the long, skinny leaves. That's about it. And when I say cannabis sativa or just cannabis in general, I'm so used to just diagnosing infectious diseases and identifying organisms by their genus and species name. So cannabis being the genus, you're only talking, when you're talking indica and sativa, I limit that to the leaves, because as we had mentioned earlier, the biochemistry is the chemistry is really where it comes down. And then again, how you respond is going to be different, can be completely different from someone else. For example, say you want that feeling in that the head feels, maybe a terpene like myrcene that has the ability to cross the blood-brain barrier or aid in that with other phytocannabinoids. Maybe you like that, whereas other person will completely say, I do not want that at all. I just want to feel comfortable, but I don't want to feel too much, or whatever the terms that they use. So it's very important to kind of steer away from saying indica and sativa and start really getting into the terpene profile, knowing what terpenes are there, knowing the yields of those terpenes. And that's where COAs come into play, because when you really understand the product and you really understand what's within it, that's when you can start annotating and understanding how these terpenes are responding and working with your body and how it's going to make you feel. Because that broad category, you could even add ruderalis in there, right? Indica, sativa, ruderalis, but that's not talking about the compounds within and how that's going to actually help aiding you to homeostasis. So we just gotta, everyone's molecular biologist, everyone's in chemistry now. I don't think they realize it, but they are, because everyone's asking molecular questions. So if you keep going with that same molecular question, then keep going to get a good molecular answer. And sativa and indica is just the names of the genus and species.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of add some maybe humor for the audience listening. Maybe you knew this, maybe you didn't, but I certainly have helped, unfortunately, maybe fortunately, perpetuate it, because people come in and like, oh, what's the one that makes me upper? What's the downer? Indica usually gets associated with the sedative. Indica, couch, versus sativa is more usually uplifting. And so while, trying to poke some humor at these words, I totally agree with you. As a marketer by trade, it kind of is like where are we really going to put sativa on this packaging? But again, the consumers, they kind of are starting to associate, I want the uplifting effect versus I want the in the couch sedative, chill me out effect. And so that's kind of where we're trying to navigate between. It's like the consumer knows the effect they want. They just don't necessarily know how to communicate that effect yet. And so hopefully this conversation is helping empower a lot of people to be a little bit more exploratory with these different terpenes. So my follow-up question is for Andrew. You mentioned COAs, Anita. A COA is a certificate of analysis. It is essentially a document that is attesting for a particular product. And Andrew's company does a lot of testing. And so I want to understand from you, from a consumer perspective, when I'm shopping for cannabis products, what am I looking for? How do I even identify what terpenes are there? Like I kind of highlighted, and as we know, in the plant, when you're looking for flower or bud, it's usually listed to some extent, especially when you're shopping in, these legal states and even hemp stores. I notice people are talking about, this is a myrcene heavy, this is a caryophyllene strain. But beyond that, when you're getting into other types of products, how do consumers know what terpenes are present?
Sure. So on a C of A, you have different types. You have just your different panels. You have your cannabinoid panel, your heavy metals, residual solvents, mycotoxins, terpenes. It's for the effect side of it, you want to take into account two panels on the full panel. It's going to be your terpene profile, and then it's going to be the overall ratios of cannabinoids. So the ratios of cannabinoids are going to be that synergistic effect of kind of the, what kind of engine, to use the reference that was used before. Is this a high performance engine? Is it a diesel truck? And then the terpenes that are present are going to be where it takes you. In other words, using the blood-brain barrier, for example, if there's a high myrcene content, it tends to be more of a heady experience. You feel it more in the brain. It can slow you down potentially. Whereas, other strains that have, say, a even ratio of CBD to THC and then THCV, and then if it has a heavy citrus profile on that tends to be the traditional what people would call, a super sativa kind of profile. Not as much CBD, but the effect you're going to get is going to be more of an energizing, go do things, go hiking. It really, there's so many, the Venn diagram, again, it also incorporates your individual endocannabinoid system and what your diet's been. So you need to find out based on going low and slow and how to read what cannabinoids are there, keep a journal of what the effects were to target in on what's going to work best for you. There is a Canadian company, just as a side note, that is going to offer genetic testing in the next couple of years for people. You send in a swab and they're going to give you a profile of what your endocannabinoid system is going to look like. And then you'll be able to, based on research that's going to be done, because everybody's going to be sending in, data, they're going to build models that are going to be specifically geared towards certain effects with certain cannabinoid systems. So you can target in, I want to have this effect. I want to cut down on inflammation, target food that deals with inflammation, and then incorporate also cannabinoids that help with inflammation, and target, the terpenes that greatly reduce inflammation. So it's the whole synergistic effect. It's the entire, we've called it the Entourage Effect, but it's so much even more complex than that. So it's interesting times.
It is interesting times, but how exciting for us to be able to figure out really truly how empowering and impactful this plant can be for our own bodies. I think that for me is where it is really empowering. It's here's this product and this is the, marketing effect, but when you put it in your own body, it can transform. It can be more powerful. It can be less powerful depending on how much I'm consuming, what I'm consuming. And I think when we're looking at cannabis from this broad lens of feeling better, medicinally, for recreation, even, you're looking at cannabis being California sober, people who are choosing cannabis over alcohol. I think that's a tremendous amount of opportunity this plant has as empowering people to just use plants to feel better. And so I think that just being able to have this conversation and help people feel a little bit more educated on how to navigate it, because that is the big key. How do you navigate this? And so you've all been sharing such great points. We are almost at time. I want to encourage those listening, if you have questions, please drop them in. We are reviewing them. And I want to kick off some of the questions. I want to start with, I don't know who wants to answer this. I'm just going to start asking them. Somebody asked, would you say sativa and indica are phenotype and chemovar? And is the chemical profile of the plant? Does that make sense?
It does, but no. Indica and sativa are only terms that describe how the leaves look and how the plant itself grows. I don't even like the term, cannabis indica. There really is only cannabis sativa L, and then there's sub variations of that. And all those terms, chemovar and all that stuff, people use them. The science that's coming out is just completely, every time we lock onto those terms, it's getting blown out of the water. It's far more complex than that. And we all just need to kind of describe the effects as opposed to, predetermined labels, if that answers it.
Well said. Well said. Anything else anybody wants to add to that question? Okay, I'm going to go to the next. Go for it.
Go ahead. No, I was just going to say, I read it. That question, I was thinking it of as a phenotype being physically that the leaf physically looks a certain way, and the chemovar meaning that understanding the compounds within individually. Then if you break it down like that, I would say yes. The phenotype is just how it looks. The chemovar is what's within it, and then understanding that is how you actually really understand how you respond.
But after the 2013 genetic studies that were done on like the 60 different strains of cannabis, they showed that even the chemovars and the phenotypes don't accurately describe the plants from a genetic standpoint. So genetically, even if it looks like an indica leaf, it may not be one. So it's an inaccurate term.
That's true. And the variability of the cultivation, how it was grown, all the elements and what the yield, it's a beautiful mess.
Yeah.
There's a lot to learn, and we're going to end this on getting into some resources. So y'all start thinking about what are your favorite resources and where these audience members can continue to be educated as we close this up. But I want to pass a question over to Rachelle. Somebody asked, once the right RH, and can you help define what RH is? Once the right RH is reached, does the Boveda package need to remain? And can I use it to bring down the RH if it's too high?
Right. So RH, that's referring to the humidity levels within the environment. And for those of you who don't know, you want to make sure that the humidity levels are somewhere between usually like 55 and 65%. Otherwise, the cannabis could become too dry, or could become too wet, and mold could potentially develop on the plant. And so the Boveda packet actually has a semi-permeable membrane. And so when it goes in, it'll actually vapor can go in and out. Water vapor, water activity levels are determined by the packet. And so once the ideal RH is reached, yes, you do want to keep the packet within, because it will continue to work throughout the life cycle, essentially until you actually want to consume the bud or the plant that's in there. And yes, you can use the packets to bring down the RH if it's too humid. You can also use it to increase the RH if the conditions are too dry. So I've heard many people say, oh, my cannabis was very dry and brittle. I popped a Boveda packet in and it brought it back to life. That's something that happens quite frequently. Once the Boveda packet becomes kind of crisp, that's when you know it's time to replace it.
Awesome. Thank you for addressing that. I know that preserving the terpenes is very important, and understanding how to use some of these tools that are on the market is key in helping us navigate that. Now we are almost at time, so kind of final question to everybody. What are some resources that you can pass on to the audience to help them continue the journey of both terpene exploration and education, as well as kind of a supplemental question someone asked, are there any good resources to help track terpenes or really helping you journal? I personally know there are some apps out there. They are spacing me, but I'll make a quick plug. Find all of us on social media. We are more than happy to be your resources to further your education. And so there are definitely apps that I'm aware of. I know there is a dispensary in Colorado that makes a little paper-bound book by a company, I believe, called Good Chemistry, that is really nice. And it's a little bound book that you can journal in different effects that you're feeling and different products you're trying. But let's start with you, Andrew. What are some of your resources and tips to leave the audience?
If you want to stay on the bleeding edge of where the industry is, I would suggest creating Google alerts. Quite often, even the media that is out there, articles, they're anywhere between, I'd say 6 months to 3 years behind on the information they're providing. And there's so much information globally that's become available to us because of white papers and things like that, just read, and don't trust anything as absolute fact. See it as where the industry knowledge is currently. Science has evolved always.
+1, that one. Always evolving, always learning. Anita, what about you?
Terpenes are the scent molecules of nature. They are found in the foods that we eat, the cannabis that we consume. With different aromas come different molecular structures, leading to different effects. And just remember that everyone responds differently, and take your cannabis nature journey slow. A catalyst to my learning was the video on YouTube called The Scientist. It's not Coldplay, the song by Coldplay. It's The Scientist, where it talks about Dr. Raphael Mechoulam. And he was definitely someone who really got me going with the understanding of the molecular structures and science in cannabis. So I highly recommend to watch that video.
Thank you. And Rachelle, we'll turn it to you for any of your tips.
Sure. I really like a lot of the industry-specific publications and websites, such as, I think Leafly is really great, and they're really up-to-date. I really like Ganjapreneur. There's a lot of really good publications and websites. I also think that interacting with fellow cannabis industry professionals and consumers on platforms such as LinkedIn and Clubhouse can also help keep abreast of current developments and research coming out. So definitely, use the hive mind, so to speak.
Yes, thank you for highlighting those great social resources as well. I definitely agree. It's the power of all of us combined to help educate and continue to be educated ourselves. So thank you all for joining us for this panel. I hope it leaves you with a little bit more knowledge about cannabis and how cannabis can ultimately benefit you and affect your body. So thanks for joining the Lux Summit panel, and catch the rest of the discussions. They're all wonderful. And thanks for joining us today. And thank you, panelists, for being a part of it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.